So to what extent was Victoria and Albert's married and family life typical of their age? We'll talk about the roles of men and women in the Victorian society and the ideal, of course. The practice of private life is always very different from the ideal, but the ideal was that of the so-called separate spheres. That is, the man going out into the world, working, supporting the family financially, and the woman staying mostly within the home and the private circle, not working, caring for the children, managing the servants, being responsible for everything that happens inside the home, including like decoration and family and furniture buying, but the spheres were separate. So the male sphere was public and the female sphere was private. Of course, this does not apply to Victoria and Albert. Actually, it was the other way around. Victoria was the working woman. She was the most powerful and the richest woman in the world. And Albert was just a house husband in practice. This wouldn't look good in the press. This wouldn't look good on the family portrait. So Victoria really tried to keep the public image of being a submissive wife to her alpha male husband. To what extent Albert was an alpha male, we'll probably never know. I don't think there was a lot of dominance in his character. He was more of a quiet, scholarly, very logical man, but definitely he played along and he understood. This was probably a conscious decision on the part of the royal family to start creating this kind of good example for the subjects. This was effective. This was noticed with appreciation. One of the 19th century political commentators, Walter Bagehot, commented that he liked the idea of having the family on the throne. Of course, only the Queen sat on the throne, but in the public eye, in the public opinion, it was really the model family. They would go for holidays together. They had 2 holiday homes, both of them loved. The first one was in Scotland, Balmoral Castle, which Victoria and Albert visited first during their official visit in Scotland in the early 40s. They loved it so much, especially Victoria, who adored Scotland for various reasons. They loved it, they bought it, they had it rebuilt. Albert was quite an artistic man, and he got personally engaged in designing the interiors and the decorations, and everything is as Scottish as possible. What Victoria loved about Scotland was the countryside, the weather. She actually liked the cold weather. She didn't like the hot temperatures. She didn't mind the rain so much, so this was not a problem. And especially, as written in her diaries, she loved the people. She believed they were very honest and straightforward. They were not the kind of flattering hypocrites that she associated with the royal court. And also, according to her diary, Scotland looked like some places in Germany she knew, so being so much in love with Prince Albert, she loved everything German. She visited Germany many times to visit this side of the family. Because Scotland looked a little bit like Germany, she loved Scotland. They would go there in the summer. They would go there with their children. Then they would really play to be Scots, more Scottish than the Scots themselves. They would wear tartans and kilts, and Albert would go stag hunting. And if you look at the official portraiture from this period, it shows Albert bringing the deer for Victoria to, I don't know, eat at dinner. So being the ultimate provider, predator, and he never was that, but he loved Scotland. He enjoyed the less official time there. The other holiday home was in the Isle of Wight. The residence was called Osborne House, and it was a kind of Mediterranean style palace, also designed by Albert himself. And this was another place they would go with the children. They would spend long months in the summer, and basically after Victoria became a widow, she would spend a lot of time there as a recluse, basically. If you ever have a chance of going to Osborne House, it's very interesting. The gardens are quite vast. You can see Victoria's bathing machine. We'll talk about when we talk about Victorian leisure activities. So this was like a changing booth before going to swim in the sea. Victoria actually knew how to swim and she liked it, so she had this changing booth installed for her on her private beach. They had a little part of the garden called the Swiss cottage or the Swiss chalet, which was a kind of alpine style house made for the children. So the children would learn practical things there. They would have a little kitchen where they would learn to cook and to serve meals. They would have little vegetable gardens. Each of the princes and princesses would have their own plot and the gardening equipment, and they would grow vegetables, and they would actually sell them to the palace kitchens to know the value of money. Victoria and Albert, especially Albert, he was the modern parent, I would say, much more than Victoria. He was really engaged in the child rearing, and he wanted to educate his children. He wanted to make them into model princes and princesses. Another thing they had in Osborne was a little fort which Albert and the boys built themselves out of brick and local stone, and they would have a miniature cannon, and they would shoot the cannon and play to be, I don't know, soldiers and conquerors, and so something that the children really loved. And Albert, as I said, was a very engaged father. And this was not a secret. So, for example, in the popular press, in the illustrated press of this period, you have images of the royal family celebrating Christmas together, so they are all gathered around the Christmas tree. You would even have illustrations of Albert actually playing on his knees, hands and knees, with the children, romping around on the carpet. So yes, he would do that. However, he believed, and this was something that would probably be rather painful, especially for the most important child, so the Prince of Wales. He believed that because he was so talented and so ambitious and so kind of intellectual, that all his children should be like that. The first child, Vicky, was a wonder child. She was the kind of child who would learn how to read and write at 3, and she would speak foreign languages, and she would like to display her skills to the guests, and Albert was immensely proud of her, and he only wished that she was a boy, because the next child, little Bertie, his name was Albert Edward. When he finally became king, he chose his official royal name to be Edward the Seventh. So the little Bertie was quite the opposite. He was you might say a little like Victoria's side of the family. So he loved to play. He enjoyed food. This was the problem in later life. He would enjoy all the pleasures of life to excess. So he was quite overweight. He drank too much. He smoked cigars, which would eventually lead to him dying of cancer. He would enjoy the company of women. This was something that really became a massive problem later on, but even in his early childhood, he didn't like to learn. He didn't like to be educated like Albert was when he was young, or Vicky was just before him. So Vicky was like, I know, there was less than a year and a half difference between them, and Vicky was this wonder child, very intellectual, very bright, and Bertie was a child who didn't like to learn. He would just play, he would throw tantrums, and whatever Victoria and Albert tried to do, they engaged tutors, and they insisted on the tutors being very strict. They would even resort to physical punishment, so the royal children would get a spanking, which was a common practice in the 19th century and was believed to be for the benefit of the child. It didn't work. It didn't work, and in time, you might say that Victoria's relationship with her children followed the unfortunate pattern of the Hanoverians. So the reigning monarch and the Prince of Wales were in constant disagreement and even feud. And as I said, young Bertie started to display some interest in the opposite sex, which would be a natural thing if he wasn't the Prince of Wales. So when he was a student, he was sent to the university. Of course, he didn't live with other students. He lived with a private tutor who was instructed to guard him well. However, Bertie, being a very sociable young man, and this was something that he kept all his life, he liked company, he liked making friends, so he very quickly made some friends with perhaps the less reputable among the students, and once they managed to smuggle a young actress into his bedroom, so probably he lost his virginity with her, and the news of this really reached the ears of Victoria and Albert, and this was a shock. This was an absolute scandal they wanted to avoid, and you have to know why. Victoria and Albert were very faithful to each other, which wasn't a role in the royal family, if you know, but their childhoods were very peculiar. Victoria, as I said, had problems with her mother and her supposed lover, so she was very strongly against any, I would say, license towards the free love, let's say, in the romantic type. Albert's parents separated because of his mother's infidelity to her husband. So when Albert was around 6, he had a brother, older brother, who would later become the Prince of Coburg. Their mother had an affair with a member of the princely court. This was discovered. Her husband and Albert's father divorced her and exiled her from the court. She died soon after in poverty. The children never saw her again. So both Victoria and husband grew up with a very strong belief in marital fidelity, and the fact that they were married for love only added to that. They believed that you should marry for love. Of course, you should marry the appropriate person, and then you should remain faithful to them. Also, Albert's brother was also a rather disreputable man, and he contracted a venereal disease in his youth. He contracted syphilis, which was a very serious disease. and eventually this led to his infertility. He had no children, and the throne of Coburg passed to the children of Victoria and Albert. So the idea that the Prince of Wales, that the future king, could have a mistress, could have illegitimate children, could have venereal disease, this was a calamity for them. So Albert just ran to speak with his son, to have a kind of proper father-to-son talk. This was in autumn. The weather was bad, it was raining, it was cold. He caught a chill, which very quickly, within a few weeks, developed into a more serious illness. And in December 1861, Albert died, aged just 42. He was the same age as Victoria. They were born within a few months of each other. So this was completely unexpected. Historians sometimes say that perhaps he already had a serious illness, perhaps he had cancer he didn't really know about yet. The official version is that on top of the chill, he also contracted typhoid, which was a disease caused by contaminated water, which was a very big problem in the 19th century. Even in the royal palaces, the water supplies were not very safe. So anyway, he died, and Victoria, at 42 years of age, was left a widow. And we move to the fourth part. So after Prince Albert's death, Victoria was left a young widow. However, if you look at the photographs, and you have to remember that from the 1840s we have the beginning of photography, so much of Victoria's family life has been documented in photographs. When we look at her images in the 60s, she looks much older, she looks very stern. She never stopped wearing the black, quite distinctive clothes of the widow. The normal social practice was that most widows would wear the fullest mourning, so the kind of clothes of bereavement for 1 year after the death of their husband, and then for 2, maybe the second or 2 more years, half mourning, so darker clothes, but not exclusively black. For Victoria, there was no option. She wore the widow's weeds, so the distinctive costume of a widow, until the end of her life. So she looked much older. For something like 10 years after Albert's death, she remained in seclusion. She did not take part in any official functions like official visits and opening of the sessions of parliament, all the things that the monarch is supposed to do. She did not do it. Now you would say that she was clinically depressed. Probably modern medicine could help her. Not the medicine of the 19th century. There were, of course, rumors that she would lose her mind like her poor grandfather, and she would be mad and she would be kept somewhere in one of the royal castles as a kind of royal prisoner or incapacitated. This wasn't really the case, but she was really, really severely depressed. What helped her was exercise, physical exercise. She always liked horse riding, and her doctor recommended horse riding as the means of getting her out of her depression, and also the attention and friendship with another man. And if you want more on this, I strongly recommend you look up the film, another feature film with Judi Dench titled Mrs. Brown, or Her Majesty Mrs. Brown. And this tells a story about Victoria's friendship with her Scottish servant called John Brown. He was one of the many servants who mostly helped with the horses and with the hunts in Balmoral in Scotland. But after Victoria's bereavement, he was employed to go to Osborne House, to the Isle of Wight, to help Victoria with her horse riding. And quite unexpectedly to everybody, including the royal children, who were quite grown up by that time. They were teenagers or young adults, except for the youngest children, really. But they struck a friendship, and the extent of this friendship, again, is a mystery. It will never be known whether or not they were anything more than friends. There were, of course, rumors that they were lovers, that even they were secretly married. Victoria could marry someone she chose. We will never know. The official version is they were only close friends, and he was her confidant, her assistant, and definitely he helped her to overcome the worst of her grief. So eventually she decided to take part in the official functions. Slightly earlier, she started taking part in the private functions, in the family celebrations, like the weddings. So Vicky married the heir to the throne of Prussia. After the unification of Germany, he would become the German emperor. There was a proper princess, a Danish Princess Alexandra, found for the Prince of Wales, and the idea was that she was supposed to be Protestant, but she also was supposed to be very pretty, so they found the prettiest available Protestant princess in this generation, with the hopes that he would be faithful. Of course he wouldn't. But they were married, and they at least started the family, and the younger children were also married off, following what Victoria, together with Albert, hoped to create, namely to link the aristocratic and royal houses of Europe. So eventually Victoria in her later age started to be known as the grandmother of Europe, because her children and her grandchildren would basically populate the courts and thrones of Europe. So all the German principalities, and one of the granddaughters of Victoria became the last Tsarina of Russia. So if you remember the tragic story of the Romanovs, the last Tsarina, the one who was eventually murdered by the Bolsheviks, was Victoria's one of her favorite granddaughters. Another granddaughter ended up as the Queen of Spain, and basically most of the royal and princely households of Europe were closely related to Queen Victoria. The idea behind it, of course, in the view of Victoria and Albert, was to promote peace, prosperity, cooperation in Europe. As you know, as we now know, with the benefit of hindsight, it didn't work this way, and the First World War happened between the cousins, between the close family. So this wasn't really working this way, but the hopes were very high. You have to remember, in the 19th century, especially in Britain, this was a particularly peaceful time. There were no internal wars, so basically all the military conflicts concerned the colonial possessions of Britain, and they were far from the shores of England, and the prosperity was growing, the social conditions and the culture and science and everything was just developing, and everybody thought it would last forever. That is why the First World War was such a massive shock, and this was basically the end of the era, much more than the Second World War. So Victoria, as the widow, she was lucky enough, despite her bereavement, to have a very stable political situation, and she could really remove herself from public functions because she really had very good politicians, and especially the two prime ministers of her later reign, again, one she adored and one she disliked. Would be very important here. The one she adored was the leader of the Conservative Party, so the descendants of the Tory party, Benjamin Disraeli. The family had Jewish origins, but they were Christians. Disraeli, before he started a political career, was quite a successful novelist, quite a successful writer. He was a dandy, he was a very flamboyant character, and he knew how to flatter a woman, and he always treated Victoria as a lady, as a woman, as someone to flirt with, to flatter, to bring flowers from his own garden, and to praise her books, because she decided to publish 2 volumes of excerpts from her diaries retelling her travels to Scotland. So when Disraeli first came to Victoria as the Prime Minister, he praised her books. So what else to expect? She adored him. She would really work perfectly with him, and his pet idea, his main political goal was to strengthen the colonial greatness of Britain, to strengthen the British Empire. He arranged for the purchase of the Suez Canal. Very interesting story, we don't have time for that. You may want to Google it. He arranged for Victoria to have an additional title given by the Parliament, the Empress of India, which is important, and we'll return to that. So his policy was really to promote the international position of Britain and to strengthen the colonial greatness. The other politician, the one that Victoria did not like, was the leader of the opposite party, of the Liberal Party, so the descendants of the Whigs. His name was William Gladstone, and she did not like him because he could not flatter her. She once complained in a letter that he addressed her, Gladstone, as if she were a public meeting. So he could not really strike this kind of personal connection with her, and she really relied on personal connections all her life. So he became the disliked prime minister. They alternated with Disraeli for something like 20 years, so Victoria could be quite safe that the country was going well. Gladstone was a typical Victorian do-gooder. He believed his favorite pastime was chopping wood, so nothing flamboyant or artistic. His another favorite pastime was walking the streets at night and trying to reform prostitutes. So approaching the sex workers and trying to persuade them to give up their trade and to find a decent employment. Did not work. Some say there were rumors that he enjoyed more than preaching to these women, but we'll never know. Anyway, he was a very stern, serious man. He didn't care for the British Empire so much. So he got at least once in open conflict with Victoria when he did not support a military action to help General Gordon, who was stranded in Africa, and eventually he was killed in Africa. Victoria blamed Gladstone for that. Gladstone believed that there are enough problems at home in Britain, especially the plight of the poor, and his pet idea was to grant more independence to Ireland. He would have very long speeches in the parliament in support of the Irish Home Rule. He was never able to convince the parliament, but if you remember from history, Ireland would eventually get Home Rule early in the 20th century, and this is perhaps the legacy of Gladstone's politics. But back to the private life of Victoria, and another film that I would recommend for you to see, again with Judi Dench playing the Queen in her later life. The title of this film was Victoria and Abdul, and this is based on a true story. Of course, the feature film changes some details of the story, but the main outline is actually true. So after Victoria was created the Empress of India, she took it very seriously, and she declared the wish to have some Indian servants, to have some servants brought from the subcontinent, and to mark her jubilee. The 50th anniversary on the throne, two young Indians, not Hindu but Muslim Indians, were brought to Britain to be servants, to be something like waiters at the table, so to serve the Queen at the table. And one of these two Indian servants was a young man called Abdul Karim, and again, just like it happened 20 years earlier with John Brown, Victoria struck a very unlikely friendship with this young man, much to the scandal of the royal family. So the royal family did not like John Brown, they were very jealous, and this young foreigner who could be Victoria's grandson, suddenly becoming her closest confidant, her friend, and even her teacher, because she said she wanted to learn one of the Indian languages. She did. She actually learned it quite well. There were discovered some notebooks that Victoria filled in Indian writing. So it took quite a long time to find somebody who could actually read this. But again, John Brown was dead. He died in the 1880s, so Victoria was bereaved again, perhaps not as horribly as after Albert's death, but she was lonely, she was misunderstood, she believed that nobody really treated her like a person, and so she enjoyed immensely the interest and the kind of exotic charm of this young Indian. This ended, of course, with Victoria's death. Abdul Karim was kicked out of the royal court by Edward VII. While it lasted, it was quite interesting, and definitely, whatever you may say about Victoria and her flaws, she was never ever a racist, and she believed that her colonial subjects were as important as the English ones. So Victoria died in January 1901, so very good for the chronology, so just as the 19th century was ending. Also, the life of the Queen ended. She was buried on the grounds of Windsor Castle, next to Prince Albert, as she has planned for 40 years. And this is really the end of the era, because the Edwardian period that we are going to discuss later on was different, and Edward VII was a completely different style of monarch than Victoria. Next week, so for this week, please Google Victoria. Perhaps watch a feature film about her. the TV series, or perhaps a documentary. There are so many different materials about Queen Victoria that I don't think I will give you any links because there would be too many. So find something, try to get yourself acquainted with the Queen and the royal family, because next week we'll talk about other groups, other strata of the society, and especially the concept of the Victorian values. So thank you.